Right now, I got a few words for some of our brothers and sisters in the occupied zone. The chair is against the wall. The chair is against the wall.
Boys and girls, prepare to be astounded, bedazzled, and otherwise stupefied.
John has a long mustache.
You are now listening to Peace Propaganda.
And we're here for you.
Hello. This is Peace Propaganda, episode 43. Peace Propaganda is a show about the positive trends towards peace and liberty. I am your host, Adam Elpo. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. So, you may have noticed that there weren't episodes the past couple of weeks, and that was intentional, partly. As I said in the last episode, I hope to put out episodes more frequently, but I want to put out episodes that I'm proud of, and I want this to be not necessarily something that sticks to a rigid schedule, but something where I have a chance to really gather my thoughts and put something out there that isn't being said elsewhere. I don't think people tune into this show just to get the news rehashed. You tune in, I should say, because there is an echo chamber in the media, even in a lot of alternative media. It's a lot of the same stuff, and I don't hear a lot of it making a whole lot of sense, to be honest. So that's why I do the show, and I want to make sure that I'm not just putting out stuff to put stuff out. It's got to be something that isn't being said or not being said nearly loudly enough. Okay, so to that end, there was a news story that came across my desk a couple weeks ago, and so I did a show, and then the news story changed. I was like, okay, well, now I gotta change the show. But I already recorded it, but I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna record it again, otherwise it's not gonna make any sense. And then the news story changed again. So here we are on recording number 3 of this show, of episode 43, because I delayed. I didn't have anything to talk about for reasons that I just explained, and then the show kept the story kept changing. What are you gonna do? Here we are. Hopefully, this is the last recording, and I'm sure it will be the best. Now I really have everything down that I want to say. So the show is going to be about social change. It's going to be about social movements and the relationships between the on-the-ground dissatisfaction with the status quo and how that interacts with the law. Yes, how it interacts with government action. Because social change, social movements are a tension between the way things are and the way that many people want things to be. Right? So things are one way, and a lot of people are like, well, wait a minute, things should be different. And then they get mad as hell, and they're not going to take it anymore, and they start marching in the streets. The Civil Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Movement, I should say, comes to mind, right? Perfect example of an interesting interplay between the law and a social movement. And there is another interesting interplay, which is the relationship between people's philosophies and how they self-identify, and how the lines start to blur, and how the definitions start to wobble and collapse in on themselves. So what am I talking about? Normally, day to day, if things are going along, in the status quo, monetary inflation, perpetual war, the usual, people can rely on liberal policy recommendations matching up with what they generally conceive as liberal philosophy, right? So liberal philosophy is things like we should use, well, these definitions get so iffy, right? So here's what I mean by it, and here's what I think most people think of when they hear of liberal philosophy. Whether or not it actually embodies John Locke and Adam Smith is another story. when they think of liberal philosophy, they think of things like the nanny state. They think of using the government to provide for people. They think of equality, equal rights, both in terms of civil rights and voting rights, things like that. And then, of course, conservative philosophy. You start to talk about the wisdom of existing institutions, right? And that these institutions include a collected body of knowledge. And when you agitate for social change, well-intentioned as it may be, you start to mess with this collected wisdom, and the repercussions may not be immediately obvious. Okay, so that's where conservative philosophy has its roots. This resistance to change, because, to put it in modern terms, there might be blowback or there might be unintended consequences. You may want something to happen, and then lo and behold, something else happens. Something totally unforeseen happens. So it's interesting then when a conservative person begins to agitate for social change, because it's sort of at odds, right, with this idea of conservative philosophy. They step into the shoes of liberal philosophy, not necessarily the nanny state type liberal philosophy, but if you think about, for example, Thomas Jefferson, famous liberal, he wanted a new constitution every, I think it was 14 years, and the reason was he believed that the world, that the nation, belonged to the living, and that if laws and if institutions were allowed to get too long in the tooth, that eventually they would no longer represent the changing times or the interests of the living. And so there's a fun term that somebody I know came up with called necrarchy. This comes from necro and archy, so it would be rule by the dead, and that is kind of what the Constitution is, right? It's, ruled by the dead, in a manner of speaking. And so when a conservative agitates for social change, they're stepping into the shoes of a liberal. They're saying that something about the existing institutions is not right, and it needs to change. And so then you start to get, once these lines are blurred and people are changing hats, you start to get strange bedfellows. People who don't necessarily agree with the main thrust of the social agitation, but they may identify a blowback that they actually want, or they may identify some other unforeseen or unintended consequence that they're like, oh, well, if I latch onto this social agitation, then I might, as a byproduct, get what I want. And then that's when you start to get really strange bedfellows. People who would never think about working together, who think that if they just work together on this one thing, that they will meet their own ends, which sometimes are self-contradictory, just based on their analysis of the situation. Excuse me. So let me bring this into the realm of the real. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, my girlfriend, as a matter of fact, a couple of months ago, and she was laying out. If frequent listeners may know that my girlfriend is a progressive. She's a liberal, and she is an attorney. So you can imagine the conversation. To be a fly on the wall. Maybe I'll have her on the show one day. But we were talking about the civil rights movement, and she's very clever, and she properly identified the sort of the progressive statist viewpoint of the Civil Rights Act, which is that there was social tension, which culminated in the passing of legislation, which addressed, if not all, then certainly many of the concerns of the people involved in the civil rights movement. That's sort of the standard story of how social change occurs in a democracy. Let me lay out an alternative explanation of what happened. This was the meat of the conversation that I was having with her. An alternative explanation is that there was social change, that there were a lot of people who were saying, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. The way things are not as they should be. And so they agitated, they protested, they staged sit-ins and all the rest, and marches. And things were getting unstable if you were the government, right? There were riots. There was civil disobedience. The police were, to enforce these laws, these racist laws, the police forces were becoming stretched. They were spending a lot of money, right? These are not all totally not ideal situations if you're a government. So the strategy at work was not one of, oh, well, they're making a lot of good points. How do we address this? How can we fix this? No. In fact, the law acted as a pressure release valve, siphoning off people, weakening the movement, who said, oh, well, I guess I'm not mad as hell anymore. Maybe I'm just a little irritated as heck. So I'm not going to march anymore. It's not worth it. Good enough. Well, what more can we reasonably expect? The pragmatist in them say, well, we got something. That's pretty good in the Civil Rights Act. But of course, the Civil Rights Act does not necessarily embody the spirit of the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement didn't reach a crescendo, which was then enshrined in the civil rights acts. The civil rights movement was cut off at the knees of the Civil Rights Act. Consider for a moment the famous speech from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who explained that he had a dream that one day his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now contrast that with the Civil Rights Acts. If you're not familiar with the Civil Rights Acts, studied them extensively in law school, let me explain. If you are a black individual and you tell the government that you have been aggrieved by your employer, let's say, that they have violated the Civil Rights Act, the first thing that the government will do will say, is this allegedly aggrieved individual a member of a protected class? And then they will go through the list of protected class, one of which is race. Okay? So let me break that down. Dr. Martin Luther King said, judged not by the color of their skin. And the Civil Rights Act said, and a matter of national federal policy says, your case, and by extension, your actions and the actions of people around you, will be judged by the color of your skin. There is friction there, right? Now, I'm not saying that the Civil Rights Acts were evil. I'm not saying that they should be repealed. Well, I'm an anarchist, so I think the government should be dissolved, but the Civil Rights Acts are not at the top of my list. They're not first on the chopping block. Let's put it that way. There are certainly worse offenders out there. I'm willing to concede that the Civil Rights Acts were generally a positive thing, I suppose, from the viewpoint of the statist mentality that they embodied the desires of many people. Okay, but the Civil Rights Acts were themselves cut off at the knees by the limitations of government. Okay, which I don't have time to go into here, but the point is there is friction there, right? There is the friction between the spirit of the Civil Rights Act, judged not by the color of your skin, and the embodiment of the legislation, which is judged by the color of your skin. Okay? So, in that case, you see that social pressure was manifestly shortened. It was relieved by legislation. Okay, so legislation can play a role in provoking, or in this case, alleviating social pressure. Alleviating, rather. Social pressure. So now we come at last to the news article at play. Indiana recently passed the Religious Freedom Act, which is interesting to me on multiple levels. One, because I am, in general, interested in how the government, how it works, how it likes to screw everything up at every possible turn. And it also interests me because you may have heard that Gen Con, the nerd convention, is threatening to pull out of Indiana. And I am a consummate nerd. I love board games, tabletop role-playing games, Star Trek, the whole list. Love it all. Sci-fi, fantasy. I'm a nerd, okay? So this hit me on multiple levels. I was like, well, I got to do a show about this, right? And so if you're not familiar, the Religious Freedom Act allows business owners in Indiana to discriminate on the basis of race or really anything. Well, I'm not sure actually if it allows you to discriminate on the basis of race. It might only be on the basis of religion. In any case, it allows or gender or sexual orientation. The specifics in this regard aren't important. It allows businesses in Indiana to discriminate if the discrimination is based on the business owner's religion. So sorry I screwed up that description so badly, but you get the point. You get the gist of it, which is that they can discriminate if they can justify their discrimination on religion. Interesting stuff, right? And so it has caused some strange bedfellows, as I was explaining before, and I consider myself to be one of them. Obviously, I think that any business owner who would kick out someone based on that patron's religion or sexual orientation, I consider such a business owner to be human garbage. If you discriminate only against murderers, okay, sure. I can get behind that. But if you're discriminating against homosexuals or black people or anything like that, you're human garbage. So in that regard, I have no dog in the fight to want this legislation for that reason. And I readily concede that most of the legislators who passed it did want it for that reason. I'm not concerned with their motives. I'm concerned with the actual effect of the law. And what I see as the actual effect of the law is transparency. Right? Everybody wants more transparency in government and in business. And I see this as a beautiful form of transparency in that these bigots can shoot themselves in the foot. I will know where not to give my money. And I think a lot of people manifestly over the course of the last couple of weeks have shown that is how they view the situation too. Now, unfortunately, they are misdirecting their social agitation. They are taking the statist storyline, that narrative, that if you want social change, what you got to do is get together with a bunch of people and petition the government. No. Look at the momentum that is building up around this Indiana Religious Freedom Act. So many people, so many businesses are angry about this. And what they're angry about is the idea that there will be bigotry in Indiana, that people will be treated unjustly. But what they're doing, where they're directing the action is not towards the bigots, not towards the people actually engaging in prejudice, but towards the government. I think that is a damn shame. For multiple reasons. For one, if they're successful and Indiana repeals the law, then we go back to the old way, where I may or may not be, or any Indiana resident may or may not be financing bigotry every time they go to a business, because that business is then prevented by law from exposing to the world what terrible people they are. Okay? And so I said it would be a shame for multiple reasons. One is that they will be losing that transparency, and two is that it's a waste of effort. They could be using this to put these bigots in the poorhouse, right? Just don't shop there. This is I mean, so many people are up in arms about this. If that many people stopped shopping or stopped patronizing these businesses, they'd go under. Look at what happened in the Civil Rights Act. To bring it back, the sit-ins were very successful. A lot of people don't know that, but if you look at the statistics throughout the civil rights movement, during the buildup of the civil rights movement, businesses which discriminated against black people failed at a much higher rate than businesses which did not. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that. They don't really teach you about that. They teach you that the sit-ins occurred as a tactic to affect government policy. No. They were there to raise awareness. Think of it more like a gay pride parade, which, they of course have their political aspirations too, but a lot of it is about just, look at us, we're normal people. You don't have to hate us, you don't have to fear us or whatever. You don't have to be bigoted towards us. And it was really successful. The average white family in Alabama or Mississippi during the civil rights movement would read it in the paper, and they would see on the news or hear on the radio about these protests, and the evidence suggests that they would think to themselves, wow, well, I never really thought about this whole no Negroes allowed policy, but I guess it doesn't make much sense. And they would stop shopping at those businesses. It's true. And I think that is the much more effective way of doing it. That's the much more permanent way of doing things. If you pass a law against it, then you just create an underground. Then it's just there's not only the bigotry doesn't go away. In a lot of cases it gets more severe, because not only do they have whatever twisted reasons they already have to dislike this group of people, but on top of it, they have the resentment that now the government is telling them that they have to interact with these people. Now look, if I haven't made it abundantly clear when I called them human garbage, let me reiterate: I have no sympathy for bigots, but I'm explaining that is the process. Okay, making a law against it doesn't make it go away. So it's unfortunate that there's so much misdirected attention towards government, especially because a lot of these businesses are talking about pulling out of Indiana. Gen Con. You remember I brought up Gen Con. They're talking about pulling out of Indiana, and I get it. But the convention center that hosts them rather, as far as I know, does not support the legislation. They have no intention of utilizing this new religious freedom, so to speak, and being prejudiced against anyone. And to be honest, I haven't seen any clear message from Gen Con saying that they have actually encountered the effects of this law in any way. And I think if they did, say every year Wendy's has a booth there. The manager at that Wendy's has decided, gosh darn it, we're not going to serve any of them gays. Well, then don't let the Wendy's be there. There you go. Problem solved. But what's actually going to happen is that now this convention center is just going to lose a bunch of money. And that Wendy's, which probably had no problem with gay people, is going to lose a bunch of money. Not that I care about Wendy's. I should have made it a more sympathetic company. But you know what I'm saying? Like, think about just the people who live in Indianapolis who sell their wares at Gen Con. If you're not familiar with Gen Con, it's pretty much like a big marketplace where nerdy stuff gets sold. And yeah, there's a lot of big national companies there, but there's also a lot of small businesses that go there that are local to the Midwest, and especially local to Indianapolis. And they're not going to be able to possibly make the commute to wherever Gen Con moves. And that's unfortunate because they had nothing to do with this, right? They presumably, and if they did, if they put up a sign that said, these are my paintings of dragons and wizards. If you happen to be gay, you cannot buy one. And Gen Con could say, you know what? Get out of here. You can't sell here. That's the way to deal with it. Unfortunately, now that person just can't sell there because there won't be there. There will be in Ohio or something. And that's unjust. Maybe not unjust. That's a strong word. But that sucks. Right? Then the bigots are sort of, they're hurting people across the board. Not only the people that they're bigoted against, but just like unrelated third parties who may not care anything about politics. They're getting hurt for no good reason. And maybe it sounds like I'm overplaying this, but if you go to Gen Con, you'll see what I'm talking about. There's a lot of small businesses there, and it's not like they're just going to go to the other big nerd convention in Indianapolis. Like, it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's the only one. It's the only game in town. So, I think I've made my point. So, the overarching point that I want to make, to bring all this together, is that I am a strange bedfellow to this law. I do think that it will have an unintended consequence of reducing bigotry. Because that clarity, that knowledge, that sunlight, that transparency is how things change. Making it illegal, pushing it underground, just hides it, just creates more dissatisfaction. But if these things are on the surface and they're able to be talked about, let me make that point real quick here at the end. Right now, it's just sort of a low hum in society that like racism is bad, but most of the things like you can't come and eat here if you're gay or if you're black, like that doesn't exist because it can't exist. So it's not really made clear to people what racism or homophobia means. Oftentimes, occasionally there's violent crime and that's tragic, but of course that's already illegal. But on like a day-to-day level, it's not clear what it means. And I think that this kind of stuff, if people grew up in a society where like there was that one pariah business where no one went because it was owned by old man Jenkins who just hated them blacks, and people would talk about it. People would be like, "Fuck that guy, he's an asshole." And instead of just being never talked about, which is kind of how it is now, right? So forgive me if that's not the best example, but I'm sure you can think of your own example where transparency is a good thing. I want to know. I don't want to spend my money at those businesses, and I don't think you do either. And I think a lot of these people who are rightfully concerned about bigotry are unfortunately misguided when they go to the government to fix it. Because they have the power, clearly. I mean, if you're on social media right now, I mean, everyone is on the side against the bigots. They're just directing their energy in the wrong way. So, that does it for another episode of Peace Propaganda. I hope you enjoyed it. That was episode 43, and if I said anything crazy, not unbelievable, if I said anything crazy, why don't you reach out to me at host.peacepropaganda@gmail.com, or you can find me on Twitter at Peace Podcast or on Facebook at Peace Propaganda, and I would be happy to get back to you. And that's part of the reason why I do the show the way that I do, which is not on a set schedule. I do a show which I know appeals to a niche crowd, and that's the way I like it, which is why when people reach out to me, when people reach out to the show, I make a point of getting back to them. To my knowledge, I've never not responded to a message. Maybe an email has been lost. It happens, but I'm pretty sure I've responded to every message that has ever been sent to Peace Propaganda. I'm also on Google+. What am I saying? Peace Propaganda. You can find me there. Love to interact with you. That's the way I've set up the show so that it could be a small community of people that I can build a relationship with the listeners. And if you've been listening to the last couple shows, what a cool relationship it's been. So, thanks again for listening. This was Adam Elpo with Peace Propaganda. Goodbye.